prohibits teaching children that an individual, by virtue of their race, gender, or other characteristics, is inherently inferior, racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. So why are we talking about this bill in the context of book challenges and book banning? Because despite what's actually written in the law, the reality is that these provisions are discouraging the careful examination of historical and current discriminatory practices within our schools and society. While discussion of these concepts is not prohibited by HB 2, those who wish to delegitimize public schools and discourage diversity and inclusion work have perpetuated an inaccurate narrative that such work is indeed prohibited. And this has led to fear and confusion among educators about how and what they may teach, while encouraging complaints against them that jeopardize their licenses and careers. The atmosphere of fear and intimidation caused by HB 2 is exacerbated by the unprecedented rise in book challenges we are seeing not only across the state, but across the country. I'm going to pass this on to Shauna Coppola right now. She'll be giving you a brief history of book challenges.
Hi, I'm Shauna Coppola. I am an education consultant, a literacy specialist, and one of the co-founders of Oyster River Equity and Justice. I'm also on the education committee of the Racial Unity team. I'm going to try to do both things at once. So just a really brief history, and there is a handout that offers a lot of what I'm going to be saying up here, and also some QR codes to some interviews with some authors whose work has been most challenged in the past year. So as long as we've had books, we have had book censorship and book bans. Many times these have happened through rulers and people in power. So for example, the Chinese Emperor Qin Huang banned certain history and philosophy books because he wanted his people to believe that history really started with him. And this is not super uncommon. The Roman Emperor Caligula also banned the Odyssey and felt that it was dangerous because it expressed Greek ideas around freedom. And we have lots of examples throughout history of people in power determining what folks can have access to and which texts they cannot have access to. In the United States, a lot of historians point to Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin as the first really widespread ban, but there were actually bans and challenges before that. This one you see up here, the Meritorious Price of Our Redemption, was actually burned on Boston Common, and the reason for that was its criticism of Puritanism. And also during Grant's tenure as president, many of you are probably likely aware of the Comstock laws. Part of that was really concerned with obscenity and what people had access to, what kinds of ideas people had access to. And so one of the kinds of texts that was prohibited through the mail were texts that had information about contraception. So we're seeing lots of threads that are being echoed today in many ways, which is terrifying. And I thought this was an interesting poster. It says, 10 years ago, the Nazis burned these books, but free Americans can still read them. A little bit of an ironic poster here. Many of us are aware of the book burnings in Nazi Germany. One of the things that I actually did not know about these book burnings is that one of the first series of book burnings was around content that was provided information and research around gay and lesbian and queer folks. And so one of the things that I just recently learned was that one of the Nazis' first kind of big actions was a raid on the libraries of the German Institute of Sexology in order to get rid of that information and prevent people from accessing it. as a practitioner of comics and graphic novels and someone who loves teaching children to write and to read them, I've always been really fascinated by the comic bans and the comic scare of the 40s and 50s. Some of you may be familiar with this, may remember this, and in this case, comics were banned because there's a really fascinating history around the German psychiatrist, Dr. Frederick Wertham, who said that he found a link between comics and juvenile delinquency. And this led to certain congressional hearings. It led to the establishment of a comics code. And while there were certainly things that were problematic about comics, there were certainly some racial stereotypes, some stereotypes around women and bodies that are definitely problematic. Dr. Wertham's work was largely made up and it was debunked. But still, the moral panic remained. And then I put this up here because in 1959, are any of you familiar with this book? The Rabbit's Wedding? So in 1959, no? Yes. Yes. Oh yeah, okay. So in 1959 in Alabama, a group of segregationists engaged in what we call soft censorship, which Julia alluded to. And at this time, this book was put on the reserved shelf in Alabama because folks thought that it promoted integration. It is a story about a rabbit who has black fur marrying a rabbit who has white fur. It was not a political text at all. It was actually just created this way because of the way what was available with printing and color, but it was certainly a piece of soft censorship that happened with segregationists in Alabama. And then during the 60s and 70s, there was quite a more permissive time with texts and ideas and art. And so there were a lot of moments where people had access to a lot of different ideas about the world, about themselves, about their sexuality, about race. And so because of this permissive time, there was a huge backlash in the 1980s with the Reagan administration, and that led to what was then an unprecedented rise in book challenges, but that has since been surpassed by what's happening now. And that was also when I believe that American Library Association had their first banned books week in 1982. Yeah. And this is a photograph from that time. So I really encourage folks to dive into the history of censorship of books and banning books. It's really fascinating. It's very disheartening as well. But I think what's most important to think about is the patterns that we see in this history of censorship, particularly in the United States. And these are some questions that I really encourage folks to ask. One is who is engaging in the vast majority of these challenges. There's certainly a pattern here. Like I said at the very beginning, typically folks in power, whether that's earned power or unearned power, official power or unofficial power, have been the ones who have done the vast majority of challenges in this country. So it's important to think about patterns around identity, who is doing this, what are their ideologies, and who is most affected by these challenges. The lack of access, who is most affected by that? When has this happened? Now this is one answer I wanted to actually give rather than ask a question. And oftentimes when you look at the timeline of censorship and the waves of censorship around books, it often happened after a perceived progress, perceived social progress of certain groups, which is certainly the case now, and also perceived threats to the status quo and dominant ideologies. Also, I encourage folks to think about why and to look at the reasons why different texts have been challenged. You'll definitely see a pattern there as well. And also which books have been most challenged and banned over time? And what are we seeing today in terms of which books are getting the most challenges? And so I'm going to pass the mic to Hope Godino, who's going to talk about library challenges.
Thank you. I would like to explain how we, as a public library, choose our books. We have a collection development, okay, hear me? We have a collection development policy. And that is what we use when we select the books that you're going to find in the library. And the purpose of this policy is to serve as a guide for us at the library and for the books and materials that we want to bring to the library. And our purpose as a library is to inform the public of principles on which selection for libraries are made, and we stick to and use the Library Bill of Rights, the freedom to read, and the freedom to view. And our collection policy is for all of our materials, but it comes in most importantly when we're talking about nonfiction. When we're talking about nonfiction, we want to know that it has had a critical review by a source that is not related to the author or the publisher. And I brought a couple. We use Library Journal. We use something called Book Links, which is usually children's books. We use Kirkus Review, and we use Book List. And any book that we decide to put on the shelf has to have, nonfiction particularly, has to have a positive review from one of these, so that we know, especially if it's something historical, is it true? Because we don't want to start putting books on the shelf that are telling you that about a history that is not true. So we're very careful on what we choose. When we put a book on the shelf, we hope that we've chosen particularly for our audience. We chose in this library for the residents of Exeter. We choose what we think they'd be interested in. We choose what we think will help educate them. We choose what we think that they have wanted because that part of the collection might be a little soft, doesn't have enough. That's basically how we choose books. When someone doesn't care for a book, we have a process called reconsideration of a book. And the process includes that it is only in this library, you have to be a resident of the town to say, I don't want that book in this library. And then we have a form that you would fill out, basically asks for the title of the book, the author of the book, the person who's objecting to it, whether it's for themselves or somebody else or an organization, what they object to, why they might object to it. There's so many things. There's a lot of questions because we want to know for sure that we can answer those questions. But the objection often is from a parent. We find parents tend to object to some of the books in the children's room because they feel that they're going to hurt them or might be too sexual or, well, they're not, but that's their point of view. So we ask a number of questions for people to fill out, and one of the major questions is, did you read the material or view the material all the way to the end? 9 times of 10, they don't. The history here in book challenges, we've had a number over the years. Basically because the way we handle a book challenge is we don't say, fill this out. We listen. And most people, when they have something that they dislike about a book, they just want to have you hear what they have to say. And once you listen to them, we're not going to agree with you because we don't ban books here. But once you listen to them, usually they get all of it out and they know that you're hearing them and they'll be able to listen to what you might have to say. And many times it's, let's say with children's books, some of the fairy tales are straight out of Grimm. The Little Red Riding Hood does not make it to the end. She just doesn't. She dies. And some parents don't like that, and I can understand it. That's why the recommendation is to that parent, read these fairy tales all the way to the end before you read it out loud to your child. In fact, that's usually what we tell parents about young children anyway. Read it to the end before you read it to your child. That usually, for someone who wants to challenge a picture book, usually works. We've only had one challenge that went beyond the I don't like this book to a real challenge. That was a graphic novel. It was in the 80s. It was before I was the director. The mother objected to the fact that the picture on the cover was a woman who was wearing what Wonder Woman wears, nothing. But she's Heather, but that's about it. And her complaint was that she didn't feel that this was proper for her 15-year-old son to see. And what she wanted us to do was get rid of the book. We said, get rid of the book, put it in the adult collection, or put on his library card that he was not allowed to take out any books that had somebody that looked like that on the cover. Well, we don't do that card at all. It went to the trustee, she filled out the whole thing, she did read it all the way to the end, and she did admit that yes, the story made sense, and she understood why the person was dressed up like a superhero, because she was, but she still was upset about the way she was dressed. And it went through the whole system, and we finally told her that no, we were keeping it in the collection because it was meant for young adults, her son was a young adult, and it was going to stay there, and no, we could never put anything on someone's card they cannot take out. And so the only choice she had left was she had to monitor her son. And I think that's what people need to learn, is if you object to something for someone in your family, it's not up to you to take it away from someone else. So I just brought a couple of books here. This book was banned and burned by Hitler. Ferdinand the Bull. Yeah. And the only other thing I want to say is we talked about soft, what? Because it's subversive, and it's degenerate, and it's propaganda, and he's too pacifistic. He's a pacifist. What can I say? He didn't want to hurt anybody. We did hear about soft banning. There's another way we see soft banning, especially in children's libraries. The books are just taken. Somebody steals them. They're just gone. I have, that's on my list, I got a great list. I don't know if I brought it. I've replaced King and King, I don't know if you've ever seen it, I've replaced that book 5 times. And Tango Makes 3, I've replaced 5 times. Heather Has 2 Mommies, My 2 Dads, I don't know how many times I've replaced that. It's just, they're gone. Somebody takes them, doesn't like it because of what it's about, and they take the book and it's gone. And so our response to that kind of censorship, and I hope it is every libraries in the world, is buy another copy and keep buying those copies until whoever it is that keeps stealing them stops. I'm going to give this to Mark Jalucci.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everybody. It's usually not a problem to hear me, so I'll try to actually dial it down a little bit. Thanks for the opportunity to talk tonight. I hope that I can help raise some awareness without raising your blood pressure too much with this. I want to echo some of the things that Hope said and sort of put a school spin on it. I am the head librarian at Exeter High School. This is my 3rd year at this high school. Previous to that, I worked at Sanborn High School over in Kingston. I want to talk a little bit about our criteria for selecting books, what happens when someone challenges a book, and why we pick the books that we do. So, school libraries in general, should be a place where ideas and information are freely exchanged. That's the whole goal. At the high school level, that means that students should be able to access information that helps explain the world that's immediately around them, but also that explains the worlds that they are not familiar with, so that they can get a larger picture of what the world is really about. It does a disservice to a student if we only talk about things that they know. We need to expand their world so that when they're out there in the world, they understand that people don't always agree with everything that they say. They have different sets of beliefs. Okay? They fight about different things, and that's okay. That to survive in the world, you need to understand where other people are coming from. So it's my goal to create this collection that does that. We talk about window books and mirror books, which I'll talk about in a second. But it's a daunting task to create something, especially in a school library, that runs the gamut. You know, that introduces people to the universe of ideas. I have some help. This is the guidelines that Exeter High School has put out for selection criteria. I have copies of it over there if you're interested in seeing it later. This is a public document, so please read it. One of the things that it says is I should always choose materials that consider the diversity of race, ethnicity, culture, class, religion, gender, sexual orientation, physical and mental ability, occupation, and life experiences. That's a lot. Okay? It's my job to provide that information to students, always. It's not only my job, it's my charge to do that. And this is something that a lot of folks don't understand. Okay? I'm trying to open up the world to people. And sometimes that means providing kids with information that some people find highly controversial. Let's talk about window books and mirror books. Mirror books are books that kids can read that explains their life. It's a life that they understand. It's the life that's right around them. Here's a classic example of a mirror book. By the way, if you've never read John Green, please do. He is my favorite author. This is my favorite John Green book. It's called Looking for Alaska. For the majority of students at Exeter High School, this is a mirror book. It's about a high school student at a private boarding school who falls madly in love with a woman, with a girl who really couldn't care too much about him. Something tragic happens to her in the middle of the book, and he spends the rest of the book with his friends trying to piece all this together, trying to make sense of the tragedy that sometimes life is. This is a mirror book for most of the students at Exeter High School. This reflects their life experience. This is a window book, The Hate You Give, because for most of the students at Exeter High School, it talks about a world with which they are not familiar. The main character is a high school student, but that's about the only similarity that this student has with with most of the students at Exeter High School. This is a book that kids need to read, not particularly this book, but they need to read these window books so they can get an idea about what the rest of the world is like. And these are the books that cause problems with people who want to challenge books. This particular book has been challenged because it has profanity, violence, and it's an anti-police theme to this book. This book also has been challenged because it was, quote, too racy. Okay, I'm not exactly sure what that means, but these books have both been challenged along with this book, which I'll talk about in a second. So that's the theory. That's why we buy the books that we buy, because we need to expose kids to a range of ideas. That's our job. That's our charge. That's how we educate children. If someone takes exception to this, we, like the public library, we have a form, a reconsideration form. The main thing about it, and you talked about this also, the main question here is, have you examined the entire resource, the entire thing? Have you read it from cover to cover? Can you talk about it eloquently? Can you tell us what the book was about? Okay? You can't just say it has a swear word in it, I don't want it. Or it has a picture of a dog that I don't like, I don't want it. Right? You have to have read the entire thing in its entirety and explain to people what it is about the book that you object to. Also, and this is important, the back says, are there other resources you would suggest to provide additional information or other viewpoints on this topic? This specifically says, we will not ban the concept of this book, okay, under any circumstances. Okay, even if we agree to remove this from the shelf, which we will never do, okay, over my dead body. But if that happens, even if we remove that book, we're not removing the idea of that book. So you better tell us the book that you want to replace it with, because that's how it works, right? So I've been fortunate since I've been here, and I really don't want to poke the bear here, but at Exeter High School we have yet to have a formal book challenge since I've been here. This is only my third year here. I was, like I said, for 5 years down at Sanborn, also did not have a formal challenge. Interestingly, the only challenge I've had since I've been in Exeter came from a student. And this is the book that was challenged. It's called Pyongyang. It is a graphic novel that talks about life in North Korea. And I got a very long and very intense email from a student last year who said that she wanted to ban this book because it said derogatory things about Asians. And she is of Asian descent, and she took exception to that. And so, rather than just dismiss it, I met with her for an hour and a half. And we talked about basically we went through this process. What is it you don't like about this book? Have you read this entire book? What do you think it should say? What would you like to replace this with if we have to replace it? And what I tried to explain to her was, okay, so this book does not paint North Korean people necessarily in a great light, but have you thought about the fact that life under an authoritarian regime does this to people, right? Maybe the author is making commentary about what totalitarianism does to people. She didn't respond to that, and that's fine. I mean, she said her piece, like we talked about before. Most people just want to be heard out. We agreed to disagree, and she still comes in the library and reads books all the time. So that's fine. But that's the process that we have to go through at the high school level. And I know my 5 minutes are up, and I want to turn this over to Joel. I did not talk specifically about HB2 because Joel's going to talk about that, and this is much more acute because he's a classroom teacher. It doesn't apply to me quite as much as it does to Joel. This is Joel Waskowicz.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone, for being here
Excuse
tonight.
me, could I interrupt for just a minute?
Yes.
I'm sitting back here, I cannot see any of you. Is there any reason why you can't stand
Yeah,
up?
I'll be glad to stand, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, it's good to see everybody. My name is Joel Waskowicz, and I have the privilege of living in Exeter and teaching English over at the high school. I've been there for 7 years, and like Mark mentioned, I'll get to lean into more of my experience within the classroom. So one of the things I love best about teaching English over at Exeter High is that a cornerstone of our department's work is independent reading. We know that students, we probably have a show of hands. How many of you were ever forced to read a book in a classroom that really made you miserable about reading? Has anyone had that experience? Yes, all right, we arrive on common ground. I've been there too. And I know that as folks come in, like no matter the content, there are some books for a kid that's gonna be miserable. And sometimes that might just be because as a teenager being told, here, do this, read this many pages and have it back tomorrow is an immediate instigator of putting a wall up saying like, well, you don't know anything about me and I'm not gonna do it. And I've been there before. And we know that for some students, there's no way to work around that because it's developmental. But we still want them to be in books, and we don't want them to leave thinking like, oh man, like that guy ruined everything for me because he gave me 7 books that I hated. And so we bring our students to the library and we begin every class with independent reading. We urge them to find the book that suits you, whether that's a graphic novel or a comic book or it's nonfiction or it's memoir or it's a piece of fiction in a variety of genres. But one of the things that we emphasize and that we engage with the community about is that we're not going to be banning or censoring the books that the students choose. And so we send home a contract that's not just like kind of like a rule that we speak and maybe some people hear it, maybe they don't. Like no, as we send home curricular materials at the beginning of the year along with our plagiarism policy, some of the stuff that's really strict in the logistics. We have the students sign that document, we have a parent or a guardian sign the document, and it talks through why that's a policy that matters a lot to us in the department. Not just having students engage in independent reading regularly, but then also allowing them to choose the books, and we see readership grow in passion as students choose books that they know register for them. Like Mark said, finding mirror books or finding window books, sometimes those windows are really big and really, really bizarre as students dive into, totally unforeseen worlds, and sometimes, they're just engaging with a character who's so different from them. And suddenly they realize like, oh, I never thought of it that way. But I see students who come in on day one, and there's always at least one, usually like 20, who tell me, they're like, I don't read. Like, okay, it's good to meet you. And then we take it one step at a time. And sometimes a student only gets through, a couple books in the year, but oftentimes, and this is always really satisfying, but you don't grin to be smug, but that a lot of times the student who said I don't read on day one is the one who finished like 25 books by the time the year ends. They're the one who are, banging down Mark's door to order a series or like, hey, where's my next book? And that's exciting, and a lot of that is because of the independence. We know that generates enthusiasm among, especially readers of the age group that we get to work with at the high school. But I want to talk a little bit about HB2 as well, because that's another component that's much newer. The independent reading policy has been part of my experience since I arrived at Exeter. Last year, obviously, HB2 came into the common discourse regarding teaching, and it was introduced at a time when agitation was incredibly high for so many reasons, for so many different people, and for teachers, and then members of the community as well. I think part of that heightened emotional intensity brought about some really escalated responses. And I know for teachers, there was an immediate sense of kind of dread and this sense that I can't teach what I teach anymore. This bill is dropping, and it's putting a gate up around the things that I bring into the classroom that I've always valued and been instructed to bring into the classroom. And then on the flip side, I think there were some folks who responded by thinking, oh, this means that now things can be shut down in the classroom. There are topics that aren't allowed to be discussed anymore. And both of those responses are obviously hold validity, because the way we respond emotionally to things represents something that we're really feeling, and that matters. Like Hope and Mark have said, that person should be listened to. That person should have a conversation about why they're reacting that way, because it reflects so much about where we're coming from and what we're experiencing, either because of our passions or our fears or our curiosities. But for both teachers and for other folks responding maybe in opposition to a teacher or to a topic, the fact is that this bill hasn't restricted the things that I'm allowed to bring up as, as topics in the classroom. There's obviously a lot of nuance and complexity in the language regarding how these things might be addressed and how that, how statements might be presented in curriculum, in material that's presented. But one thing you might know about teenagers is that you can't predict what they're going to say. And so no matter what, we're always navigating, ground that can be incredibly sensitive because even if I preview my entire curriculum and say, we're in the clear, he raises his hand in the back row, and you call on him, and he says the thing you did not expect to hear. And then this turns into a conversation, and it becomes teachable, and we lean into that, and we ask things like, why did you say that? And this begins a conversation that might shed light or reveal a disagreement. I might hear someone say something that I would never say, or that I've never held as a belief, and yet it's my job to engage with that student and to teach them, and to be part of that work. And so that might make it sound like it's all good, but I would be remiss if I didn't also emphasize the reality that within the bill, the language can feel very broad. The language can feel very ambiguous, and that's left room, for a lot of folks to feel like this gives me room to leverage the bill in a way that might be elevate my sense of power over what happens in a student's classroom, or maybe not even in a classroom that impacts or that my student is connected to. And so we've had teachers, feel like they're kind of treading ground that might be dangerous because of the unknown, or this sense of being, intimidated or threatened, and not just, conceptually, but quite, explicitly, by folks who have, used the bill in a way that, might feel as if it's been loaded against that teacher. And then a lot of folks, I remember the conversation at the beginning of last year so often was, quiet conversation, nervous conversation of folks saying, can I still teach this? And being told over and over again, yes, keep going. But also teach it with an understanding of nuance and complexity, which is the nature of our work. And it's so important to remember that. I think it's easy as well for the language of the bill to spread this kind of like plant seeds of suspicion, of like, what are they really doing in there? And that's not the case. What we're doing in there, I can tell you, is we're focusing on critical thinking. That's the biggest thing I want my students to be able to leave with. And that's the idea that you walk into the room as you, and I walk into the room as me, and there is no guarantee that we're going to see eye to eye on anything, and that's okay, because that's what our world looks like. But when I present an idea to you, I hope that you will be ready to question me on that idea and ask me, why do you believe that? And then share your own perspectives. And then, if you disagree, build on why you disagree, instead of just creating a standoff, or even worse, weaponizing language in a way that says, well, you're an idiot and I can't respect anything about you, because that's a wall that we throw up when we feel like either we can't get through to someone or we can't be seen. And the same goes for me as a teacher. It's not my job to turn these pupils into versions of myself. In fact, that would be a really frightening experience. You read about that in a lot of the dystopian books that engage in conversation and learning, be part of a discourse. And then also recognize that picking up a book, the fact that someone has written a story, doesn't mean that that author is endorsing every element of that story. Much in the same way, when you see, a news story reported, or, you hear a fairy tale, it's not like, wait, the big bad wolf? What, you're trying to turn everyone into the big bad wolf? We know that's not the case, but nor is the writer trying to turn everyone into Little Red Riding Hood. We teach the book The Great Gatsby. It's been taught, but there are a lot of folks who are in here who have read it. Maybe you raised your hand earlier about it, and you're like, God, that one. But at the end of that book, most folks aren't leaving and be like, and now I'm ready to be the Great Gatsby. One, if you haven't read it to the end, spoiler, that's not a good ending for him. And then secondly, there are so many things that this character does that are not admirable. And so F. Scott Fitzgerald engages in a book built around the persona of this character, and at the end you look at him critically, and you say, why did he turn out like that? I don't want to turn out like that. And you've spent hundreds of pages engaged in his narrative, and you walk away feeling critical of him. That's powerful right there. That's the work of reading like a critical thinker and a critical reader. And so when a book is presented and you put it down and you say, I disagree with so much of what was there, thank goodness, because that means that your mind is operating. And I hope that in those instances, a student goes and they talk to somebody else. They say, have you read this book? And they look at it together. And maybe they talk to someone who has read it and loved that book. And they engage in that discourse right there, and they start to consider, why do I feel what I feel? Why do I value what I value? And I hope that they bring it back into the classroom and they engage in that kind of discourse with their teachers in a space that's designed for that work to happen, because we know that critical thinking is muscular. even if that feels more metaphorical than physiological. But knowing that when you exercise the practice of critical thinking, you become a stronger and a more urgent and passionate critical thinker. And so I hope that more and more students are going to engage in books and disagree with them, and agree with them, and question them, and read beyond them, because that's the heart of the work that we're trying to do in the high school. And obviously I'm speaking from the experience of one person in one classroom in one city. There are so many other experiences, and I encourage you, talk to teachers. Ask them about their experience, ask them how they've been impacted. Ask them about things that you agree with, ask them about things you disagree with, but keep engaging in that discourse, because we're so grateful that in this space we can be here engaging with all of you, and I learned so much from those conversations, and I'm grateful that you can be here for one tonight as well. So thanks everyone, and I'll be glad to pass it along to Devin Chafee, who will keep us going.
Thank you so much, Joe, from that perspective as an educator, somebody on the front lines. And I just want to start by thanking the Racial Unity team for organizing this event, as well as Exeter Library. It's just so wonderful to be here in Exeter during Banned Book Week. Pat Yasha and I have spent every Banned Book Week for I think the last decade here in Exeter in some way doing programming, and I look out and I see all of you here today, the amazing turnout today, and I'm like, this is why I love coming to Exeter. And so you all are so engaged here. You have such a lovely community. You're all engaged. You care about these types of issues, and you have a lovely library and library staff. I love being on panels with librarians. I think that they are some of the most fierce civil libertarians that I have ever worked with. They will fight for their patrons' rights like their lives depended on it, and I can tell just in hearing from the librarians here that they are among the best. If you come out of the restroom, you'll notice the Library Bill of Rights facing you right in the face. That's how you know the commitment is here. I also have to say, Hope, that Pat gave me the King and King for I have 8-year-old twins, and a couple of years they're going to age out of that book. I'm sending it to you. We're going to keep you well stocked, don't you worry.
You always need a coffee.
Absolutely. And so it's really wonderful to be with you here tonight. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just talk a little bit more about HB2. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the context in which it was adopted, a little bit about what it says, what it bans and what it doesn't, and then a little bit about the ACLU of New Hampshire's lawsuit challenging the law. So I'm the executive director of the ACLU of New Hampshire, the American Civil Liberties Union of New Hampshire, which is essentially New Hampshire's largest civil liberties organization. And we do litigation in the courts, we do work at the State House, and we do organizing within communities to that end. And I think it's important to sort of take us back in time to a time before 2020, when I remember a time in New Hampshire when I was collaborating with folks that were doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and it wasn't considered partisan, and it wasn't even considered particularly political back in 2019. I mean, this was just work that folks were doing out in the community, and I don't think there wasn't a lot of at least visible pushback. It was generally pretty accepted in at least most communities that we were operating in. And in fact, it was such so that like at the time I was serving on a diversity and inclusion advisory council for a Republican governor, and along with a whole wide diverse groups of actors. And when the bill that turned into this HB2 language was introduced, nobody thought it was going anywhere. And that was true not only for the ACLU. When we reviewed that bill, we're like, this is not going to move, as well as all of our partners who we collaborated with. Now, we showed up, of course, because we know that things can happen, and we opposed it. But then the type of momentum that it got during the legislative session, and then we began seeing the type of momentum that these types of efforts were having all over the country and in local communities throughout New Hampshire through 2020. And that was really the context in which this was happening. And then, so the HB2 started as a standalone bill. and then it got sort of roped in, amended, and added to the budget, even though it had nothing to do with the budget or expenditures. That's how things sometimes happen. It got added to the budget, and then was passed and signed into law by the governor. And it includes, it's important to understand that HB2 language is not like New Hampshire made. It's not something that some New Hampshire legislator of the 400 or State House made up, right? The 4 concepts that are banned in HB2 actually come from an executive order that was adopted under President Trump. And in fact, it was challenged before a federal district court and partially enjoined that executive order. And so a court actually prevented that executive order from from actually being enforced. And yet New Hampshire went ahead and adopted a law that included 4 of the 10 banned concepts that were in Trump's executive order. And so it's also, I think, important to understand, so it was coming out of the Trump administration, and it was also part of a very politicized nationwide effort to adopt these laws. So at the time, we talk a lot with the ACLU affiliates in all other 50 states. We have affiliates in all 50 states. So I was hearing from people in Idaho, I was hearing from people down south, I was hearing from people all over Delaware, all just states all over. I'm seeing this bill, this is what the text looks like, they're trying to get it into our education budget, or they're trying to get it into our state budget, all using the same tactics, all using the same talking points, all using almost identical language. And it was clear that this was something that was building up, quite frankly, for an election year, right? This was something that they were determining was politically viable, and it was going to be used for political purposes. And it was also happening at the time, you really saw it at a local level here in New Hampshire. I mean, we're still seeing some of it, to this day, where at a very local level, in school districts, and I'm from Hopkinton. Again, I got 8-year-olds in the Hopkinton school district, so I'm showing up at my school district meetings. And even in Hopkinton, which I think most people consider to be a progressive community, you had people standing up talking about critical race theory and why are they teaching these things in our schools, and you just saw this sort of local surge of using people's fear around race and otherness and difference, and really using that to start fires and attack, quite frankly, the local school system. And so it was really in that context that we saw the banned concepts signed into law. And I think that that is really, it's important to understand that context, and it's also important if you look at the legislative history to understand that this is not that this is a law that was passed with very serious intentions. And you can tell that both from the political context, as well as you can tell that from the context of what legislators were saying when this law was adopted. And so the law was signed into law, and what it essentially does is it allows individuals to file lawsuits against schools and teachers in the courts, or it allows them to file complaints with the Department of Education if they believe that one of these 4 banned concepts was advocated for or taught, or even there's reason to believe in the Attorney General's explanation implied support was given for any of these banned concepts. And the penalties under the statute are extremely severe. It can result in decertification for a teacher, which for a teacher, that's like career death, right? That means it's not just, it's worse than getting fired, because if you are decertified, that means that you cannot get hired at another school. And so the question kind of comes what does the bill ban, right? And that is the $1 million question that, let me tell you, you can talk to all the lawyers in New Hampshire and you will get a different answer from each one. It's really hard to figure out what exactly is this law banning. And I think this is part of what is causing this fear around, can I talk about implicit bias? Can I talk about racism and sexism? What happens if that kid in the back of the class brings something into this conversation? Could I possibly be in violation of this statute? And I think, you look at the language that Julia put up earlier. Thank you so much for that. And it's kind of well, no, we don't want teaching of discrimination, right? And We don't want people to teach discrimination in our schools, and I don't believe that's what you're doing, Joe, and I don't believe that's what any of our teachers are doing. So I'm going to read you another one of the concepts. This is the fourth concept. And this is, we just recently had a hearing before a federal judge, and he and the Attorney General's office went back and forth about this one for quite some time. This is how it reads. The people that, the banned concepts is you cannot advocate, instruct, or train any student that people of one age, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, race, creed, color, marital status, familial status, etc., cannot or should not attempt to treat others equally and or without regard to age, sex, gender identity, sexual orientations, etc. And the judge was like, what does, like, and the judge and the AG's office went back and forth, and finally the judge was like, I have been on the bench for like 20 years, and this is somebody who was appointed by George W. Bush. He's like, if you and I cannot figure this out, like, how is the teacher supposed to figure it out? And, we've heard, and that is what we've been hearing, from throughout the state, from teachers from throughout the state, and we really spent the 6 months after this law was passed, talking to teachers in the classroom, talking to administrators, going from school to school. And what we found out was that you have some schools that are amazing, like Exeter's school system, which is like, you teach what you feel you need to teach, and we are behind you 100%, and they sent out guidance, and their teachers feel supported. And then you have other schools that are like, I think you better take down a poster, or like, I don't know about that book, whether or not that book is okay. Can we and should you actually be teaching books like, this book is anti-racist? We have talked to teachers who are like, no, not after HB2. I can't risk having my career obliterated because I teach this book, even though I was planning to teach it on my syllabus. I can't teach Stand for Kids, Racism, Anti-Racism, and You. These are the books that now teachers in a lot of school systems are very concerned because either they're not getting the support that teachers are getting in the Exeter school system, or they're just not being told anything, and they're kind of being left to figure it out for themselves, and they're really struggling with it. And so, and you can see there's reason for them to be concerned because our Commissioner of Education, Frank Edelblut, has stated publicly that using these types of books, in fact, this book, the Ibram Kendi book in particular, he has cited this as being a complaint that he has received that this book was used and he thought was serious enough to investigate for its use. So these are the types of things, exact type of teaching that the Commissioner of Education, who is the enforcer of this law, is citing publicly in public op-eds and before the New Hampshire School Board that these are concerning things that are being taught in our classroom. And so after about 6 months after the bill was passed, we filed a lawsuit. And again, after spending about 6 months talking with educators throughout the state and collecting stories about how people were struggling with this. And we are very honored to be representing Andres Mejia. Does anybody here know Andres? Because you are Exeter and you are awesome, and you have Andres Mejia as your high schools or your school district's diversity, equity, and inclusion officer, as well as with Tina Kim Philibot, who's in Manchester in a very similar role.
I know Tina. I think we should have a hand raise for anyone who knows Tina. She's a rock star.
Anybody who knows Tina, absolutely. Go Manchester as well. And so I'm just going to end here because I have gone over my time and I want to leave time for questions. But it's really important to me that Tina and Andres' voice be heard tonight because I have it's such an honor for our organization to be able to represent them. And I think you should all hear directly from them.
Hi, my name is Tina Kim Philibot.
Hello, my name is Andres Mejia, and we are both New Hampshire educators.
We're among the plaintiffs in the Banned Concepts Act. Some might know it as the Classroom Censorship Bill or HB2.
Yeah, we want to take some time to just validate the lived experience of people in our state, the youth, the educators, everyone living in our state, especially people of color, people from the LGBT+ community, people with disabilities, and so on.
We also want to acknowledge that we're in a heightened sense of hatefulness right now. Lots of people might be telling you that what you're experiencing isn't that big of a deal or it's not real, but we're here to say that we know you're hurting and we're beside you.
Yeah, and also, thank you for those who are doing this great work across the state, prioritizing, making the space our state for people in these entities. I feel like they welcome it along, and yeah, thank you for the important work you're doing. Let's stay together.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Tina Kim Philibot.
Hola, my name is Andres Mejia.
Okay, hi. My name is Lori Fisher. I'm the Assistant State Librarian for New Hampshire, and I have a couple of just slides to share with you. One of my roles in the State Library is to help prepare our public libraries and also to support school libraries and academic librarians with preparing for challenges. So how do I make the slides? Okay, yeah, go ahead. So one of the first things I want to do is just give you sort of a national context about what's happening around book challenges. I am the New Hampshire Library Association representative to the American Library Association. There are chapters in every one of the 50 states and the territories, so they comprise part of the governing body for our national professional organization. And they have an Office for Intellectual Freedom who tracks challenges and has been tracking for many, many years now. And so 2021 was unusual. There were over 700 challenges nationwide. Normally the number is around 300. So you could see that things were rising. 1,597 titles were targeted in 2021. And the top 3 were genderqueer, Lawn Boy, and All Boys Aren't Blue. I'm sure many of you have heard of these books. They've been in the media as being ones that have been highly challenged, mainly not necessarily here in New England, but in other parts of the country. We're usually about 6 months behind on some of these kinds of trends, and we are starting to experience it now. Next slide, please. So the American Library Association just released the 2022 statistics thus far through the end of August. So far, it's not looking good because we're almost at 700 attempts to ban or restrict library resources already, and we still have 3 months to go. And there's more titles that were targeted, and the biggest change is that this year, more than 70% of those attempts to restrict library resources targeted multiple titles. It's not just a parent, a single parent, coming in to a public library or a school and challenging one book. We've seen this right here in New Hampshire. If any of you paid attention at the beginning of the month, Rochester had a challenge of 21 books. This was reported on in the Foster's Daily Democrat. This was a person who wrote a letter to a councilman on the Rochester City Council. He's also a state rep, and he tried to put it on the agenda, and the rest of the council removed it. So it was not, it's dead in the water right now. This is the kind of thing we're going to see. I'm not going to lie to you. This is what we're going to see going forward in a lot of our communities. Next slide, please. So the biggest changes and the origins of what's going on is that it's up 50% as far as the challenges being made by parents. But these are not just individual parents, like I said before. A lot of these challenges are coming from nationally organized, well-funded groups. And we have examples of these groups in New Hampshire. I'm going to just mention a couple of them. There is a very strong Moms for Liberty group out of Hillsborough County. There's also one in Rockingham County. In other states like Indiana and Ohio, Moms for Liberty groups are teaching people how to troll teachers and librarians' social media to get information on them that then they use out of context to try to brand them as groomers. Okay? So another group, No Left Turn in Education, there's a Facebook group in New Hampshire that's growing. There are over 100 people now. And Purple for Parents is another one. And then if any of you have ever looked at Granite Grok, that is a conservative online news source for New Hampshire, and there's a number of articles about libraries and what people want to see removed from libraries because of various reasons that we've already discussed tonight. Next slide, please. So, one thing I want to put into context here is that New Hampshire, we are lucky that we have the governance structure that we do. We are big on local control here. Okay, so public libraries are controlled by local elected boards of trustees. They are the ones that set the policies for libraries. So they are the ones who have the power to say yay or nay to a book challenge. When it comes down to it, usually the first line of defense is the director. It's usually a two-step process because you want people to feel heard. You need an appeal piece in there, which many of our libraries do. I've been harping on this, I don't know, harping, that sounds awful. I've been harping on this for over a year, that libraries need to update and review and make sure their policies are available on their website, they're available at their circulation desks in paper form, easily to find, because you want to be able to redirect people to your policies. So that's the first point on here, what's the best practices, is that you want to know the policies and processes in place and where to find them. So if you are very passionate about this topic, know what your public library policies are and have a conversation with your public library employees and do the same with your school librarians and their school policies. You're going to want to know this stuff if a challenge occurs in your community. The other thing I do want to point out here is that the challenges that we have seen and that I am hearing about from librarians across the state and public libraries, it's not just the right. There are challenges coming from the extreme left. Okay, people who do not want to see any kind of anti-climate change or anti-Fauci or books that contradict what they believe in their extreme progressive views. So it's not just the one side. There's extremists on both. And neither of them, frankly, are correct because they're asking us to remove information that should be freely accessible to the public. Another thing you need to do is lock down any personal social media accounts. We have seen in many other states, such as Indiana, Ohio, and Texas, where librarians and library staff are harassed online. And you think the law would protect you, but the law does not always protect you to the extent that you wish it would. And it's harsh. It's very harsh. Not every social media post warrants a response. I'm going to say that again. Not every social media post warrants a response. You may feel like you want to respond, or a library director or a library trustee. You really need to take a step back because sometimes that's the incendiary device that incites a huge outcry in the community that is in favor of a book challenge or a book ban. Okay, you need to sort of assess the situation and talk to the other advocates. This should never be done in a vacuum. Any standing up to a book challenge, it has to be a team effort, and there are a lot of members of the team. A lot of them are up here. And out there, we're all in this room. Can't do it alone. Also, don't take anything about the situation personally. And I've been advocating very strongly for using active listening and de-escalation techniques. And I have 2 slides I want to go over really quickly. And the reason I've included these here is I have some things that you guys can do and practice on your own that may help you in your everyday life, as well as what's helping us to deal on the front lines in our institutions. So next slide. Active listening tips. You should be attentive to the person in front of you, not distracted. Pay attention to their body language. Ask open-ended questions. Most importantly, repeat back to the person what you think you just heard from them. And you can only do that if you are paying attention and not distracted to them in front of you. Don't be thinking about what you're going to say in response. Think about and clarify in your mind what they're actually saying. And you can acknowledge feelings without agreeing or disagreeing. This is not an easy thing for a lot of people to do. And I'm going to get to that in a minute with the de-escalation stuff. Lastly, don't react. Again, listen more than prepare to respond. Next slide. So how do you sort of put this into practice? You pause. We are not in a culture where we are taught to pause. We are taught to move, get it done, come on now, let's go. I mean, I tend to have that personality myself, but you need to be able to step back when you're in a situation that's confrontational or that you don't agree with, and take a breath. And remember, you should be listening to what they're saying and then repeating back to them what you think you're hearing, because a lot of conflicts and arguments start because people are not hearing what the other person is saying. Keep your body language open and neutral. Ignore challenging tones and words and loaded questions. That's what some of this stuff on social media is doing to librarians. They're being harassed and called names and categorized. I mean, nobody likes that. But really reacting to that in a like manner is not going to help things. You can validate feelings and experiences. You don't want to discount them, but you don't have to agree. And my challenge for you tonight to take away, and this is something I've been working on with a number of library staff across the state. Many people, when you're listening to someone, you're doing this. Or you're doing this, That is implicit agreement. And that can be taken out of context. And there have been instances where challengers are talking to staff people and they're videotaping them in other states, okay? And then those video clips are taken out of context and put on social media. Okay, so think about in your own personal life, how do you listen to someone who is talking to you and about something that you don't agree with? So just do an assessment, and I challenge you to do that over the next few days and few weeks, because I think we all do things that we're unconscious about, and that unconscious piece is sometimes what escalates the situation. So this can be useful in your personal lives, with your children, or with your parents, you know. So just think about that. And last but not least, do not take anything they say personally. Book challenges are not personal. They try to make it personal to get a reaction. But it is not a personal thing. This is a nationally organized, well-funded movement to try to censor and prohibit the information from being accessible. And we need to remember that. Okay, we want to do role play, but I don't know how you want to proceed.
That's something for after the formal presentation.
Okay, so who does this go to?
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, so just a reminder, just as we wrap up our formal presentation, and we will stay here for folks who want to stick around and ask questions and engage in the role playing. But important questions to ask, just as a reminder, when you're thinking about these challenges and really looking to try to understand them, is to look for patterns. Who is engaging in a lot of these challenges? What are their ideologies? What are their identities? And the reason for that is because it really becomes apparent how a lot of this is also about power, of course. And that's really important because the folks who are most affected are disproportionately marginalized most often in all kinds of contexts. And so it's important to recognize that. Again, with the history, note that a lot of these things happen after perceived progress happens and perceived social going forward socially, and different groups having perceived progress in different ways in the culture, and also big threats to status quo. It's also important to think about how have these reasons for challenges shifted over time. That's something that's really fascinating to take a look at, is how have the reasons, which you can find and different websites, but in particular the American Library Association has been tracking reasons for challenges over time, so they're very interesting to look at and to compare with what's happening now. And what are you noticing about which texts are most challenged, which authors are most challenged, and what kind of patterns do you see? And those are just important critical questions to ask. So the last thing we want to sort of ask you as participants is to think about how you will commit to action. What is an action that you feel comfortable taking? What's a doorway into this sort of advocacy work that you might think, I can actually do that? And these are just some suggestions. The QR code links to a handout with a lot more suggestions than are on here on the slides, and we also have copies on the table. And also ask yourself, how will you hold yourself accountable to your commitment? So these are just some. Pay attention, become familiar, like we've said before, with your institution's policies. Educate yourself, learn the histories and patterns behind book censorship and suppression of ideas. Support your local school and your local library boards. Consider attending a meeting. Consider communicating your support publicly, whether that's through email or in person, making a public statement. Help bring awareness to the issue. You can wear your commitment with buttons and stickers and t-shirts. You can write letters and emails. You can amplify social media posts and other news stories. And you can, of course, get involved on a deeper level, whether it's volunteering in the classroom, at your local library, or with local organizations that engage in diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice work. And then, excuse me, yes, and then, oh my gosh, obviously, yes, vote and make sure you understand your local candidates and what their stances are on freedom to read issues. And if you don't know, ask them. And these really echo some of what we've already said tonight, some ideas for committing to action for educators and librarians. And the last one I really want to draw attention to is to really just like was said just earlier, is call on your allies for help. We are here to help you. The Racial Unity Team, Oyster River Equity and Justice, ACLU New Hampshire. There are so many people who are engaged in this work and are happy to be allies and co-conspirators in this work.